Before the snows of 1944 buried Europe in white silence, before the Ardennes erupted in the chaos that would be known as the Battle of the Bulge, there was another battlefield, one almost forgotten, one swallowed by trees, shadows, and the damp breath of a forest ancient enough to remember wars long before the world called itself modern. It was a place of whispered legends among soldiers, a place where maps became meaningless, where the enemy was everywhere and nowhere, where death didn't shout it, waited Hurtgen Forest. To the American soldiers who entered it, the forest was not a battlefield. It was a punishment, a labyrinth of pine, fog, and mine-laced earth, a wilderness carved by ravines so deep they swallowed daylight, where artillery shells burst in the treetops and rained wooden shrapnel sharper than steel, a place where the wind itself seemed hostile. It was supposed to be a short operation, a minor clearing action. It became Germany's longest sustained engagement against American forces, and America's longest nightmare of the war. Tens of thousands entered. Many never walked out. The world remembers Normandy, Arnhem, and Bastogne. But the Hurtgen remained buried beneath the myths of larger battles, its horrors hidden beneath the canopy, its dead scattered where they fell, forgotten as the war thundered onward. But the truth remains. The Battle of Hurtgen Forest was not just a military failure. It was a tragedy, a storm of mud, blood, and hopeless struggle. A place where Kurt fought a battle it could not win against nature, weather, and an enemy who turned the woods themselves into a weapon. This is the story of the men who entered that forest. The story of their fear, their endurance, their suffering, and their sacrifice. The story of a battle the world forgot, but the soldiers never could. This is the forgotten Battle of Hurtgen Forest, America's longest nightmare. In the autumn of 1944, optimism rippled through the Allied ranks. After breaking out from Normandy, American forces had advanced with astonishing speed across France and Belgium. German defenses seemed on the brink of collapse. Intelligence reports proclaimed the enemy exhausted, retreating, held together only by desperation. But victory, like the horizon, always appears closer than it truly is. As American divisions pushed eastward, they encountered a barrier unlike anything before. A massive, brooding expanse of pine and fir stretching 4 miles along the Belgian-German border. On maps, it was labeled simply Hurt. To commanders, it was merely terrain. To soldiers, it would become a tomb. The forest had been growing for centuries, its trees packed tightly together like the bars of a cage, its floor obscured by deadfall, mist, and mud thick enough to swallow boots whole. The canopy blocked sunlight, twisting day into a permanent dusk. The air smelled of resin, cold soil, and the faint, metallic whisper of impending violence. The mission seemed simple. Advance through the forest, secure the high ground, protect the flanks of the Allied push toward the Rhine, destroy German dams that could flood the plains ahead. But the Germans had prepared the forest long before the first American foot touched its edge. Hidden bunkers burrowed deep into hillsides, machine gun nests camouflaged against tree trunks, barbed wire coiled beneath carpets of needles, minefields arranged with brutal precision, artillery zeroed in on every trail, every clearing, every ridge. And above all, the enemy had the advantage of invisibility. To the Americans standing at the forest line on those first days of autumn, there was no sign of this. All they saw was a wall of trees, silent and indifferent. The first units ordered into Hurtgen were confident. They believed victory was inevitable. They believed they were unstoppable after their triumphs across France. But the forest cared nothing for confidence, and the Germans inside it cared even less. As the troops crossed the threshold from open land into the shadows, something shifted. The world behind them, the world of sky, sun, and familiar terrain, vanished. Ahead lay narrow trails twisting into darkness. Damp fog clung to their uniforms. The air felt heavier, colder. Then came the first explosion. Not gunfire, not artillery. A mine. The forest announced its rules in a single moment. Step forward, suffer. Step blindly, die. In seconds, order dissolved into chaos. Soldiers scrambled for cover, although there was none. The trees were too dense for maneuvering, too thick to see beyond. Radios crackled with confusion. Units became scattered, disoriented, swallowed by the labyrinth around them. From hidden positions, German machine gunners opened fire. Their bullets sliced through the fog like angry sparks. American troops couldn't even locate the source of the fire. The sound bounced off trunks, echoed, distorted, coming from everywhere at once. The forest was alive with danger, and the Americans had only just arrived. Artillery followed, not aimed at the ground, but at the treetops. This was the Germans' cruelest tactic. Treburst shells. The rounds detonated above the soldiers, blasting the air downward with splinters sharpened into natural knives. Wooden shrapnel rained like a storm of daggers. Helmets cracked. Coats tore. Men who would have survived an ordinary explosion collapsed beneath showers of deadly splinters. Survivors would later say that the forest itself turned against them. By nightfall, the first day had become a nightmare. Wounded soldiers cried out in darkness, but medics could not reach them. The terrain twisted sound into illusions. A plea for help might come from yards away, or from a ravine impossible to access. The forest swallowed voices as easily as it swallowed the dead. As darkness deepened, the temperature dropped. Fog thickened until men could barely see the soldiers standing beside them. The scent of damp pine and gun smoke mixed into a cold, metallic taste that coated every breath. Officers tried to regroup their companies, but the forest mocked organization. Units meant to move in parallel found themselves miles apart. Paths marked on maps became blocked by debris, mines, or cliffs. Compass readings malfunctioned. Even experienced navigators found themselves going in circles. And through it all, the Germans waited, patient, hidden, confident in their fortress of trees. The Americans had expected a battle. What they found was something far worse. A trap built carefully, deliberately, and perfectly. The Hurtgen had claimed its first victims. But it was only beginning. The deeper the American forces pushed into Hurtgen, the more the forest seemed to close around them, not just physically, but psychologically. What had begun as cautious movements soon deteriorated into a grinding, suffocating crawl. Every foot gained felt like a victory bought with exhaustion, fear, and blood. The terrain swallowed up everything. Strategy, communication, visibility, confidence. Hurtgen was not land to fight on. It was land that fought back. By the second week, the 9th Infantry Division realized the truth. This was a battlefield unlike any they had ever known. The forest had no front lines, no clear objectives, no open ground to seize. The enemy could not be seen, yet he was always present. German paratroopers and infantry melted effortlessly into the undergrowth. Their camouflage uniforms blended perfectly with the trunks and shadows. Their movements were silent. Their snipers were ghosts. American patrols reported eerie encounters, entire squads wiped out by a rifle shot fired from a treetop or an unseen hollow. Machine gun bursts erupted from behind deceptive layers of foliage. A soldier could fire an entire magazine at a sound and still hit nothing. The Germans were fighting in territory they had prepared for months. The Americans were fighting blind. A new nightmare emerged. S-mines, bouncin' Bettys. The forest floor was littered with them. When triggered, each mine leapt waist-high before detonating, spraying steel ball bearings in a full circle. They were invisible beneath pine needles and mud, impossible to detect until it was too late. Soldiers learned to fear the quiet spaces between the gunfights. Every step was a gamble. Engineers tried clearing paths, but the Germans had arranged the mines in overlapping patterns. Remove one, trigger 3 more. And worse, they had placed mines on likely medical evacuation routes. Medics risked their lives with every move. Soon, blood trails crisscrossed the forest floor. Boots lay abandoned in the mud where their owners had fallen. Stretcher-bearers worked until their arms trembled from fatigue. Hurtgen did not care about bravery. It punished movement itself. American artillery attempted to break the German positions, but firing shells into a forest only created new dangers. The explosions shattered the tall pines into jagged spears. Whole sections of forest rained down deadly splinters. Soldiers called it the wooden shrapnel storm. Tree bursts killed or wounded men even in foxholes. There was no safe ground. Every explosion felt like the forest exploding downward. The Germans, perfectly familiar with this effect, exploited it mercilessly. They registered their artillery so precisely that shells detonated just above the American lines. Even when soldiers dug deep, the bursts carved through the earth. Soon, men began to fear the sky as much as the ground. Cold rain swept across the battlefield. Then sleet. Snow. The trails dissolved into thick, clinging mud that swallowed wheels, boots, and the last sense of momentum the Americans had. Trucks spun helplessly. Jeeps became useless. Horses collapsed under the strain. Every weapon jammed more easily, every coat soaked through. Every breath burned cold in the chest. Frostbite claimed men without a single shot fired. Mud froze overnight, turning foxholes into icy pits. Soldiers curled into themselves, trying to sleep through the constant artillery. The groaning wind, the creaking trees that sounded like distant cries. The forests became a living thing, cold, unforgiving, hostile. German counterattacks were swift and precise. Small units struck without warning, then faded into the trees. Their footsteps made no sound on the damp earth. Their silhouettes dissolved into the fog. Their knowledge of the terrain gave them an unnatural advantage. American units found themselves isolated not just from headquarters, but from each other. A company might march with confidence at dusk and discover at dawn that they were completely off course, surrounded by enemy fire from all sides. Reports from returning patrols were filled with confusion. We followed the trail and it disappeared. We walked all night and ended up behind our own lines. The forest changed direction. The Germans knew every ravine, every ridge. We never saw them, but they always saw us. Panic was rare among battle-tested soldiers, but Hurtgen created something worse. Paralyzing uncertainty. As the days turned into weeks, the casualty lists grew uncontrollably. Men died from mines, ambushes, artillery, cold, infection, exhaustion. Some collapsed from sheer fatigue and never stood up again. New replacements arrived. Young, untested, terrified. Many died within hours. The forest devoured them, indifferent to their inexperience. Medical stations overflowed with wounded. Evacuation routes were constantly cut by German fire. Stretchers had to be carried through nearly impassable terrain. Often, corpses could not be retrieved for days. Some could not be retrieved at all. They remained where they fell, motionless shadows among the roots. Hurtgen held onto its dead. American commanders began to understand that the forest itself was the enemy as much as the German army. But orders remained unchanged. Avance, clear the forest. Push forward. Units rotated out only to return again. Soldiers withdrew in shock, their faces hollow, their bodies shaking. New units replaced them and walked into the same nightmare. The Germans watched with grim satisfaction. Their plan was working. They had no need to win a dramatic battle. All they needed was to make the Americans bleed. Slowly, endlessly, and they viv. By November 1944, Hurtgen Forest had become more than a battlefield. It was a cage, a crucible, a machine designed to test every ounce of endurance a soldier could possess. The initial optimism that had accompanied the American advance across France was gone, replaced by exhaustion, fear, and the slow, gnawing knowledge that the forest had its own rules. The invaders could not control. The terrain itself became the deadliest weapon. Steep ridges and deep ravines made movement treacherous. Trails that appeared clear often ended in sheer drops or hidden mud pits. The constant fog, rain, and early snow reduced visibility to mere yards. The soldiers, compasses, maps, and instruments were of little use in a place that seemed alive, reshaping itself with every turn. Supply lines faltered. Food, ammunition, and medical supplies had to crawl forward on human backs through mud that claimed both boots and vehicles. Artillery support was often delayed or misdirected because of the dense tree canopy. Every step forward was contested by nature itself. The Americans quickly realized that conventional tactics failed and hurt. Patrols became isolated. Reinforcements were delayed. Retreats were perilous. The forest had stripped them of their strength, forcing small units to fight individually for survival. The Germans were not merely defending, they were shaping the forest into a weapon. They had fortified the landscape with bunkers, hidden machine gun nests, and trenches invisible from the air. Mines were everywhere, and artillery had been registered to target every likely path of advance. Unlike conventional warfare, victory in Hurtgen did not require maneuvering large formations. Small, disciplined German units could inflict disproportionate casualties simply by exploiting the terrain. They struck at night, disappeared in the fog, and left only death and confusion behind. Every day, the Americans were reminded that the forests belonged to the enemy. From November to December, the fighting became a relentless series of assaults and counters. Each ridge had to be taken inch by inch. Each clearing had to be fought over multiple times. Soldiers learned to dread the mornings when the mist still clung to the trees, knowing that each step could trigger a mine or draw rifle fire from an unseen enemy. The psychological toll was immense. Soldiers spoke in whispers, nerves frayed under constant stress. Sleep was impossible in the freezing trenches or mud-laden foxholes. Ungergnaved frostbite set in, and disease began to spread. Yet orders were clear. Take the forest. Casualties mounted at an appalling rate. More than 33,000 American soldiers were killed, wounded, or missing in action over the 3 months of fighting, more than any other engagement on the Western Front, except Normandy. And the forest had taken its psychological toll as well, leaving survivors with haunting memories that would last a lifetime. Bodies often lay where they fell, impossible to recover in the middle of dense fire. Soldiers who had been friends disappeared, swallowed by the mud or hidden by the dense foliage. Evacuations became nightmares, with stretchers carried over miles of treacherous terrain under constant fire. Winter arrived, and with it, snow and freezing rain. The trails became rivers of mud and ice. Weapons jammed, vehicles became useless. Even the dead added to the danger. Frozen bodies could block narrow trails, creating obstacles that had to be bypassed under fire. Cold seeped into every aspect of life in the forest. Frostbite claimed more men than enemy bullets on certain days. Hypothermia became a real threat. Soldiers huddled together for warmth, but even that provided little comfort in a place where the wind cut through uniforms and trees, groaned under the weight of ice. The battle's horror lay not only in enemy action but in the relentless, suffocating environment. Soldiers fought simultaneously against men, mud, trees, and weather. Fear was constant, but death was sudden and often invisible. A single step could trigger a mine, a hidden sniper could strike, artillery could rain from above. There was no safe zone, no rear area. Even when the Americans captured a ridge or clearing, it was temporary. The Germans counterattacked, using the forest to conceal their movements, and the fight began anew. Victory in Hurtgen was measured not in miles gained, but in the lives survived. By mid-December, the forest had proven its point. It had destroyed illusions of an easy advance. It had bled American forces dry. It had exacted a price in blood, suffering, and fear that would echo in history. Hurtgen Forest was not merely a battlefield, it was a nightmare that refused to end. By late December 1944, Hurtgen Forest had transformed from a mere battlefield into an unrelenting test of endurance, courage, and sanity. The American forces had entered expecting a short, tactical engagement. Instead, they faced a living nightmare. A labyrinth where every tree, ravine, and mist-covered trail seemed designed to crush both body and spirit. The forest floor, once soft with pine needles and leaf litter, had become churned mud interspersed with craters, shattered timber, and debris from artillery and shell fire. Every step was a struggle. Soldiers sank into the mud as they tried to advance under fire. Boots stuck, weapons clogged, and the constant struggle sapped strength before the enemy even appeared. The Germans, entrenched in deep foxholes, tunnels, and fortified bunkers, had turned the forest into an indestructible maze. Every ridge and hollow had been pre-registered for artillery, every trail mined, every tree a potential death trap. The Americans quickly realized that they were not merely fighting an enemy, but the forest itself a cunning, patient adversary. Hurtgen demanded small unit tactics because conventional warfare failed. Companies often found themselves split into scattered groups. Platoons that entered together were often scattered across miles of dense terrain within hours. Coordination broke down. Communication became almost impossible. Soldiers learned to rely on instinct and experience, moving silently, always alert. Even the slightest noise could draw enemy fire. Snipers exploited every shadow. Mortar fire rained from high ridges. The forest amplified the sound of gunfire and explosions, creating an environment of constant confusion and terror. The arrival of winter brought freezing rain and snow. Visibility shrank to mere feet. Mud hardened into ice, making even movement across short distances treacherous. Vehicles became useless. Supply lines slowed, and evacuation of the wounded became nearly impossible. The cold became a silent killer. Frostbite, hypothermia, and exhaustion claimed more soldiers than any sniper or artillery shell. Men huddled together in shallow foxholes, praying for warmth, while snow and ice coated their weapons and clothing. Every breath was sharp with cold, every movement painful. Progress through the forest was measured in yards, not miles. Each ridge captured was bought with blood and suffering. Casualty reports climbed steadily. Thousands of men killed, wounded, or missing. Evacuations were delayed by terrain and enemy fire, leaving the injured exposed to further danger. Morale began to crack. Letters to families were filled with terse, fearful details. Soldiers wrote home of forests that fight back and days without end. Many units were rotated out after sustaining catastrophic losses, only to be replaced by equally inexperienced soldiers who would face the same nightmare. The Germans executed a strategy of attrition to perfection. They allowed the Americans to enter the forest while slowly bleeding them dry. Mines, snipers, artillery, and fortified positions worked in harmony with the forest itself. The enemy did not need to maneuver large armies. Small units could inflict catastrophic casualties. As Americans advanced, they encountered dead and wounded left from previous skirmishes. Corpses frozen or hidden among trees created both physical and psychological obstacles. The forest seemed alive with death, a constant reminder of the cost of every step. The horror of Hurtgen was not just physical. Soldiers suffered from mental exhaustion and fear unlike any they had known. The constant threat of ambush, the inability to see the enemy, and the endless mud and cold pushed men to the brink of despair. Officers reported that units often hesitated to advance, not out of disobedience, but out of sheer exhaustion and terror. Even those who survived the forest carried invisible wounds, night tremors, and memories of comrades, crushed by artillery, buried by mud, or cut down by unseen sharpshooters. By the end of December, the forest still held firm. Objectives remained only partially captured. The Americans had gained a few yards here, a ridge there, but every gain came at a devastating price. Commanders reassessed tactics constantly, yet the forest proved resistant to standard strategy. Hurtgen had become America's longest nightmare, a place where courage and heroism clashed with nature and cunning, leaving scars on the land and in the souls of men. Every soldier who survived understood one harsh truth. Victory in Hurtgen was not about defeating the enemy, it was about surviving the forest itself. By January 1945, Hurtgen Forest had become a battlefield of attrition unlike any the Allies had faced. The fighting was no longer about advancing lines or capturing objectives. It had become a brutal contest of survival, endurance, and sheer will. The forest, frozen and treacherous, swallowed soldiers, weapons, and vehicles alike. The first snow had hardened into ice, turning the trails into slick, twisting paths. Artillery craters froze over, hiding their depths, and mines lay buried beneath a thin white coat that lured the unwary. Soldiers slipped and fell, their rifles and gear soaked and frozen. Every movement required extraordinary effort. German forces, entrenched and familiar with the terrain, exploited every advantage. Small units launched night attacks from hidden bunkers. Snipers picked off soldiers one by one. Mortar rained fire from ridges invisible through fog and falling snow. Even in daylight, the Americans were vulnerable, for every sound echoed and misled, and every shadow could conceal death. Resupplying the front lines had become nearly impossible. Trucks could not traverse the frozen mud-laden trails. Food, ammunition, and medical supplies had to be carried by men through waist-deep snow and ice. Evacuating the wounded was a slow, dangerous process. Stretchers had to be dragged 4 miles under constant artillery and sniper fire. Commanders faced a horrifying dilemma: push forward and risk annihilation, or withdraw and allow the Germans to retain the forest. Both choices carried deadly consequences. By mid-January, casualty numbers had skyrocketed. Estimates indicate that over 33,000 American soldiers were killed, wounded, or missing during the 3-month campaign. Entire companies were wiped out, replaced by fresh troops who would soon face the same nightmare. The psychological toll was staggering. Many soldiers suffered from combat fatigue, depression, and disorientation. Night after night, the groans of the wounded mixed with the whisper of the wind in the frozen trees. Sleep was nearly impossible. The forest became a prison of both body and mind. As the Allies attempted to secure key ridges and roads, fighting reached its deadliest intensity. Every ridge had to be taken through hand-to-hand combat in the mud and snow. German forces skilled in defensive warfare leveraged every hidden trench, bunker, and natural feature. Machine guns and mortar erupted without warning. Explosions shattered trees into deadly splinters. Mines claimed those who stepped too carefully or too hastily. Units became isolated, often cut off from each other and from command. Survivors described the forest as a place where the enemy was everywhere and nowhere. One misstep could mean death, and one act of heroism could save dozens of lives or end in tragedy. Strategic objectives such as the river dams became the focal points of some of the deadliest fighting. Capturing these positions was essential for controlling flooding and maintaining the Allied advance toward Germany. The Germans defended them with ferocity, using artillery pre-registered to every approach. Mines, machine guns, and snipers turned every attempt into a nightmare. Even after capturing positions, the Americans faced counterattacks that forced them to fight for every inch repeatedly. Every success came at the cost of heavy casualties. By now, soldiers knew that the forest would not release them easily. Despite the relentless horror, acts of extraordinary courage emerged. Soldiers carried wounded comrades across ice and mud under fire. Medics braved machine gun and artillery fire to rescue the injured. Units learned to adapt to the terrain, using small unit tactics, stealth, and ingenuity to survive. Yet for every act of heroism, the forest claimed another victim. Bodies remained frozen where they fell. Relief never came quickly enough. The battle became a war of attrition that tested every man to his limits. By February, the Americans had finally gained control of much of the forest, but at an appalling cost. The campaign had lasted 3 months of unrelenting combat. The forest had been transformed from a natural landscape into a graveyard. Commanders and historians later reflected that Hurtgen Forest had inflicted a unique and terrible kind of suffering. A battle where nature, weather, and cunning defense combined to create a war that could not be won without paying an immense price. The forest had earned its reputation. It was merciless, unforgiving, and unforgettable. For the men who survived, the horrors lingered long after the last shell fell. They carried the memory of frozen mud, the crack of distant gunfire, and the weight of lost comrades for the rest of their lives. Hurtgen Forest was not merely a battlefield. It was a test of the human spirit, a place where endurance, courage, and despair coexisted in every step. The forest had won many battles against the men who entered it, but it also forged stories of survival, bravery, and sacrifice that would endure long after the war ended. The guns fell silent in Hurtgen Forest, but the echoes of battle lingered long after the snow melted and the trees began to awaken from winter-esque grip. The forest, once a shadowed labyrinth of death, became a somber memorial to the soldiers who had walked its trails, never to return. By the end of February 1945, the full scale of the campaign was undeniable. More than 33,000 American casualties had been recorded killed, wounded, or missing. German forces had suffered as well, though the dense terrain often concealed their losses. The forest had consumed men at a relentless pace, turning ordinary soldiers into reluctant heroes, ordinary engagements into battles of survival. Unlike Normandy or the Ardennes, Hurtgen was a slow, grinding affair. It was not marked by sweeping maneuvers or glorious charges, but by constant attrition. Every ridge, hollow, and creek bed had been contested fiercely. Every victory had come with staggering losses. The forest had reshaped the American understanding of combat, teaching harsh lessons about terrain, weather, and the limits of human endurance. The men who survived carried more than physical scars. They bore mental and emotional wounds that lasted a lifetime. Memories of frozen comrades, endless mud, and the unseen enemy haunted sleep. The unrelenting fear, the sudden death, and the isolation left psychological shadows that no medal or commendation could erase. Some found solace in sharing their stories. Letters, diaries, and memoirs became a way to preserve the memory of those lost. But many returned home silent, unable to speak of the horror that had surrounded them, feeling guilt for surviving where so many had not. Hurtgen Forest became one of the forgotten battles of World War II, overshadowed by the Normandy landings, the Battle of the Bulge, and the final assault on Germany. Its significance was often overlooked in history books. Yet the lessons of Hurtgen were profound. The importance of terrain, preparation, and understanding an enemy who could turn nature itself into a weapon. Military historians later recognized the campaign as a sobering study in attrition warfare. Command errors, intelligence failures, and underestimation of the forest's defenses were examined. For soldiers, Hurtgen was a personal hell. For commanders, it became a case study in how ambition, orders, and reality collide with deadly consequences. Decades later, the Hurtgen Forest still stands, quiet and seemingly indifferent. Trails wind through ridges once soaked with blood. Craters remain hidden beneath moss. Bunkers and foxholes, slowly reclaimed by nature, hinted the terrible struggle that occurred within their shadows. Memorials marked the graves of American soldiers and German defenders alike, honoring those who fought and died in one of the most grueling campaigns of the war. Veterans who returned speak of walking among the trees in silence, remembering friends, fallen comrades, and the lessons learned under fire. The forgotten Battle of Hurtgen Forest remains a testament to human endurance in the face of overwhelming adversity. It demonstrates the terrifying power of nature as an ally to the defender and the unyielding resilience of soldiers who fight through unimaginable conditions. Hurtgen was not a battle of glory, but of survival. It tested every facet of courage, physical, mental, and moral. It left behind a legacy of sacrifice and sorrow that serves as a reminder that some wars are fought not just against men, but against the world itself. Even now, the forest whispers its story to those who listen. Tales of endurance, suffering, heroism, and tragedy. It is a place where history is written not in victories or medals, but in every step taken through mud, snow, and fear. The men who entered Hurtgen Forest faced America's longest nightmare. Many did not survive, but their courage, endurance, and sacrifice ensured that their story, though long forgotten by the world, will never be erased.